the best and the worst. Amy, today we are talking about one of our favorite and least favorite topics. Today we're going to talk about stool testing.
Whoa.
I feel like I should have held a skull for that first moment.
I was going to say, you went Shakespeare. I feel like you've done that a few other times, and
maybe
you're in a Shakespeare-y mood today.
We're 188 episodes deep. I feel like I've got to jazz it up and make it more theatrical. We don't want to bore our listeners. So,
True.
Busted out a little bit of like drama and posing for those of you watching on YouTube. But let's open this up, if I may start us off, with maybe some general rules of thumb for stool testing, and then we'll get into naming the names and spilling the tea in a little bit. But first question, do you run stool testing on your clients? And if so, like how often would you say that you're doing that now?
Such a good question. Just thinking about me historically versus now is an interesting evolution, because historically I used to run stool testing much more frequently. I don't know if I'd run it in every single person, because a lot of people had already done stool testing and things by the time they find us. So I was already not necessarily thinking that I needed like the most recent stool test. If someone had it, fairly recently, I would kind of just extract from that. But I would definitely run it, I would say maybe in 75% or 80% of my new patients, some degree of stool testing, way in the distant past. And the longer I've worked in this space, I would say probably at this point, maybe 5 to 10%, we might run something. I've majorly decreased stool testing. Again, I find that, usually they've done a bunch of testing, so they're sort of burnt out on the test. We can, if they've done testing before, we can somewhat glean what might be going on microbiome wise. And then I just find that other interventions are beneficial, so stool testing isn't typically needed. So yeah, it just depends, I would say.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that my evolution has been similar. Back in the day, to be quite honest, I was enchanted by the idea that we can, test, don't guess, and we could understand the microbiota, and we could get all of this information and be really precise with our recommendations. So similarly, I wouldn't say that I ran stool testing on every single person back in the day, but I would say that everybody at least had one stool test under their belt. Does that make sense?
Right.
Like you were saying, like the people who maybe had one done with a previous provider or ordered one on their own in the last couple of months, I would probably be fine with that. But if somebody had not had any stool testing or it wasn't recent, I would be ordering it. So, kind of using that as a metric, roughly 100% of my patients would have had some degree of stool testing under their belt, informing our decision-making in the past. And now, likewise, it's maybe like 10, 20% for me. Like, we'll get into it, but I still do some of the cheaper stool testing on occasion for shits and giggles, if you will. A little punny right in the beginning of the episode here. But the point being here is that I think stool testing is not going to tell us nearly as much as we think it will. And to be quite frank, a lot of these people have done numerous stool tests and they still feel like crap. If the stool test had some magic answer, some magic silver bullet waiting for you, you probably would have found it already. So it's oftentimes not a matter of just running one more test to get the answer. It's probably that the answers you seek are not going to be found in your stool at all, and you need to look elsewhere. And you're right. And some people are just burnt out. They've spent a lot of money on testing, and like cost is a factor. But I think the bigger thing is that stool testing is not going to be the like holy grail of gut healing that we have been told that it will be.
Yeah. And it goes back to this idea too that, the microbiome is inherently the problem. Because that's sort of what stool tests are selling, right? It's if you just find this one microbe in your stool test, this boogeyman.
It was Klebsiella.
Right. It was, your IBS was Klebsiella the whole time. And so it's this whole promise that if you get this stool test and you figure out what your boogeymen are or what your boogeyman is, then you can address that boogeyman and your IBS, your SIBO, or your dysbiosis goes away if you just treat the microbiome. And I think the thing is that the microbiome's just reacting to the environment. And again, things can kind of throw the microbiome off, so it's still a big factor. But usually, again, with the people are so attracted to that promise because it aligns so closely with like the functional medicine space and like finding the factor. And in reality, a lot of times it's just multifactorial and more messy than just this one microbe causing your IBS. It's like, oh no, the microbes are reacting to the environment. If you have dysbiosis, you need to look at nutrition, lifestyle, history, like if things kind of threw something off, like accounting for that. So again, I think it's a false promise to a degree to think that you can just get a stool test and find your boogeyman and take care of that and you're good to go.
Yeah. Yeah. It's marketing at the end of the day, right? So again, like functional medicine and their favorite slogan, test, don't guess. That's marketing at its finest.
Right.
It's the lab testing companies marketing to the clinicians and convincing them that they need the testing. Otherwise, they're being sloppy and they're just doing guesswork. It's marketing to the patients, and it's the doctors marketing to the patients because, and I know because I've heard this in functional medicine circles before, like one of the ways you can convince a customer that they need to pay the high fee to come see you, the expert, is if you have a test that they don't have access to or they don't know how to interpret. So it's this idea of like, you need me and you need to pay my exorbitant fees and you need to like get hooked into the system because you can't order a GI map, but I can. You can't order an oat, but I can. So there's a lot of marketing that gets rolled up in here. And what drives me a little bit cuckoo bananas, honestly, is that we in the holistic health space throw shade at conventional medicine all damn day for being in bed with big pharma. Like, oh, they let the pharmaceutical reps come to their office and buy them lunch, and they put on these presentations and they send the doctors to, vacation resorts and cruises. And that's so crooked. I can't believe that they're in bed with big pharma. And it's like, well, functional medicine is in bed with big supplement company and big functional lab testing company.
Right.
It's the same. The companies give you free shit. They give you discounts. They might, if they like you enough, they'll invite you to be a speaker for them. Like it's the same. It's less money to be had than selling, Prilosec probably, but it's the same idea. And again, it's these lab testing companies marketing to this profession and then the profession marketing to the consumer. And it's really messy and yucky. But I think this is where, you see people on the internet and they're touting the power of the oat or the GI map or the whatever. And, I've seen influencers on Instagram, some of which we know in common, but I won't name names. But I've seen people on Instagram that are like doing a screen share of a GI map and talking about a case study. And it's marketing to people that you need to come see me and get the GI map. And I can help you with this tool. So anyway, but it kind of reminds me of how I feel about hormone testing. I don't remember the last time I ordered a damn hormone test because in my humble opinion, the hormones are never the problem. Shy of a hormone secreting tumor, the hormones are not the problem. The hormones are responsive to the environment and the nutrition and the stress chemistry and all the other shit going on. And if you can work on all of that other stuff that's feeding into the hormone problem, you don't need to measure the hormones. And honestly, measuring the hormones can lead you astray oftentimes. So I feel kind of similarly with the stool testing where, the microbiome is oftentimes responding to the environment, responding to the nutrition. And also, I'll throw this out there maybe as the last point in this little segment, but the idea that we could test the microbiome is actually really absurd and laughable when you stop and think about it.
Right.
There are 8 gazillion, I'm making this up, people, but you get the idea. Like, there's a lot of different bacteria and fungi and viruses and parasites and critters living in your gut ecosystem. Do you really think that a stool test that tries to quantify like 30 of those is actually giving you usable information? It's human ego at its finest, right? Like, well, I know that there's well over 1,000 species in the gut. Probably several thousand. But like, I know that there are several thousand species living in the gut, most of which we don't have a name for, most of which we can't even culture, let alone study. But I'm going to select out these 30 different things that I think are important, right? Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, Enterococcus, whatever. And I'm going to deem these the important ones. And this is what I'm going to sell to the consumer in my stool test. And that probably is more deeply flawed than we realize, but we don't realize it yet because we're still in our infancy of understanding this ecosystem. And the marketing for the testing is wildly outpacing where we are with the understanding of the research.
It's such a great point. It always cracks me up when I look at stool tests and they have, I think this is more common in like the full genome sequencing. I've seen where they've denoted 50% is unknown. And you're like, okay. So we know 50% of the microbiome, which you can still glean some information from, but you know zero about the half of what's going on microbiome wise in your gut. And again, it's very humbling in a way to see that on paper and to see it laid out because it's like, oh yeah, there's so much we don't know. Yeah. And it's such a good point. I wholeheartedly agree. I think the idea that we have cornered this topic and have figured it out is a little absurd.
It won't happen in our lifetime.
Right.
I'll tell you that much. And here I'll make a parallel maybe with your world a little bit more so than mine even. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think. I think iodine was the first like nutritionally essential nutrient that was like discovered or studied as causing a human disease when it's deficient. So it's kind of like if we were in the phase of human existence where we just figured out the iodine thing. And that was the only one we knew. But we didn't know anything about calcium, magnesium, folate, B12, thiamine, any of the other nutrients. It's almost like if we went around testing everybody under the sun for iodine and making it seem like iodine was the cause for all of human disease. But meanwhile, there are all these other nutrients that we don't even know about yet because we're simply not there as like a scientific community. And if we just could either embrace the unknown and embrace what we've known about nutrition for a long time, that like fruits and vegetables and whole foods are healthy and make you feel good. And like, you know, we could make nutritional recommendations long before we knew about vitamins and minerals probably by going based off of like common sense and traditionally passed along wisdom. But yeah, it's kind of like if we were giving everybody massive doses of iodine and testing for their iodine out the wazoo, but we just don't know that folate exists yet. And it is what it is. We're at this point in human existence and we should be grateful for the knowledge we do have, but also don't put all of your eggs in this basket because the basket is not as complete as you think it is.
Yeah, and I agree. Like the things we do know, you know, it seems across a lot of the research that diversity is very important. Low diversity seems to be linked to a lot of different diseases and disorders. I think, again, we know some of the good microbes. We know some of the problematic microbes. So again, looking out for those things, I still think can be potentially valuable for different people. But yeah, I agree. I think this idea that, you know, you have a little bit of a high level of this one microbe and that's causing all your symptoms is just like there's not really tons of evidence to support that usually, or as definitively as some of these tests say.
Well, you know what I'll say too, and this probably will rub some people the wrong way, but hear it, people. You probably need to hear it. I feel like this is a good example of looking for a scapegoat so that you can avoid the shit that actually matters.
Right.
Right? If you can convince yourself that it was Klebsiello's fault all along, you now don't have to take ownership of any of your bullshit baggage. You don't have to work on your mental health, your anxiety, your stress, your trauma, your relationship with food, your disordered eating, your crappy nutrition. Like, you don't have to take ownership of any of that if you could just point the finger and wag the finger at Candida or Klebsiella or whatever it might be. So it's another like avoidant tactic I see too, when people are so desperate to seek an answer in the form of testing, and they're so anxious to look for like the bad guy, the boogeyman, the broken part of them. I think for some people it can be like an unconscious avoidance coping strategy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I know we talked a little bit about how I had a conversation with a colleague about how, you know, the whole SIBO space and a lot of the SIBO leaders are presenting IBS as having like a very organic cause, meaning like dysbiosis and an overgrowth of bacteria, you know, is the root of IBS, and there's not really other potential roots. But again, I think it creates this idea of what you're describing, whereas like, okay, they're selling this idea that this is potentially like there is one singular root cause or like one major issue. And if we can just take care of that, then it takes care of all our problems.
Then everything will be great.
Right. And I think, again, like that's not supported in other evidence too. And again, like I said, I think you're dead on with the idea that it allows people to put the cart before the horse. It allows people to say like, oh no, I just gotta correct this dysbiosis or this overgrowth and then I'll feel amazing. And when they don't, then they just think they're a tough case and they need to find a new provider and they need to just hit it harder, and it just leads people really astray. Sometimes, again, I think that people just buy into that model, and so they don't even necessarily, they underestimate the value of the nutrition and lifestyle piece. I think some people, again, don't necessarily want to look into it, but I think a lot of people undervalue how much importance that is. Even if there was imbalances in the microbiome, you're not going to make much progress if there's not nutritional and lifestyle support.
Yeah, well, and that's a good way to frame it perhaps too, is that even if you do have dysbiosis, even if you do have Candida, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, Streptococcus, whatever it might be, the treatment is not going to be the world's most perfect antimicrobial. The treatment's not going to be lasering in on like the world's most specific probiotic that's made just for you. Those things could be a very minor part of your journey, maybe, but probably correcting the nutritional deficits and like the environmental deficits, if you will, that led to that overgrowth or led to the immune disruption that led to the dysbiosis, like those are the things that are actually going to get you better. But yeah, I think people definitely underestimate the value of this sort of stuff. Because I think in their mind, they're like, well, I'm so sick.
Right. Or this microbe is my problem. I think like that's the thing. It's like they've totally bought into this idea that like, yes, nutrition is important, or like, yes, lifestyle is important, but this bug is a bigger deal. And then I can maybe focus on some of those things later, potentially. Yeah. Or again, some people too, I think that they are addressing nutrition, but really they're just starving their microbiome. Like they think that they're doing a good job because they're on a strict SIBO diet or a strict IBS diet or something. Yeah. And in reality, they're undernourished and they're not they're not focusing on the right factors. And they're not really focusing on nutrition. They're more focusing on restricting, which is attached to the dysbiosis model. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's tricky. I think that there's a lot of buy-in from people from the marketing saying, oh, this is like my main problem. Yes, like diet can help, but like I'm going to get nowhere unless the SIBO is cleared.
Yeah.
And so that mentality, I think, needs to be flipped on its head. Like you're going to get nowhere if you're undernourished. You're going to get nowhere if your lifestyle's not where it needs to be. And I don't think any of these things have to be perfect, but a lot of people are so depleted in nutrition and lifestyle areas that it leaves them just turning their wheels and on this merry-go-round of going after these microbes on these stool tests, and they just don't make progress, and it's a real big bummer.
Yeah, it is. I think the longer I practice, the more I've realized that people get in their own way.
Right.
A lot. And this is not isolated to the IBS SIBO kind of world, but human beings have a really good knack at just getting in their own way and frigging stuff up. And if we can help people remove the blinders and see the truth of the matter, maybe they could start making some forward progress. But that's maybe a topic for another day. Let's get into some stool tests, because you know what's going to happen. Somebody on YouTube is going to be like, oh, they didn't start talking about the stool test until 21 minutes and 58 seconds. And they're going to have a little temper tantrum in the comments. It's fine. You can do that timestamp if you need to. But let's go ahead and talk about stool testing, acknowledging that it's far from perfect. You should not put all your eggs in one basket. We do not recommend stool testing to the majority of our clients anymore. We both kind of independently and together came to that conclusion over many years of back and forth and investigating. Let's just, if I may, briefly start with some of the options. So there's going to be different types of stool testing, and understanding that can give you the initial framework. There's culture testing, which means you ship the poop to the lab. They take some of that sample, smear it on a petri dish or whatever it might be, and they wait for the bacteria to grow. And then they are quantifying and growing and observing and testing the bacteria that they're growing on the petri dish in the lab. So that's culture. The problem with that model is that something like 80% of the gut microbiota cannot be cultured, period. We have not figured out a way to culture 80% of the microbes that you have living in you. So you're going to get a really, really, really limited viewpoint of the microbiome with something like that. The other thing I've always really suspected too is that, and I think Jason Harwilek mentioned this in one of his courses years ago, but I wonder if the shipping transit time could really influence that. Because if you think, from the moment the stool exits your body to the moment it's slapped on that petri dish, there's going to be some bacteria dying and growing really rapidly. And like the presence of oxygen being outside of the human body is going to influence that. The growth medium that they use, like there's going to be a lot of things influencing that. So I also strongly suspect that if we had the ability to test stool with a culture-based test, the moment it exited your body versus a day later, a week later, a month later, I really think that that's going to make a huge, huge, huge difference. And then you start thinking about people who either live on the other side of the country or in another country, and they're mailing in samples for like the doctor's data culture-based stool test or a CDSA, one of these culture-based tests. And I really think that they're getting a very skewed vision of what their microbiome looks like. And I have not seen clinical success in using culture-based stool testing. So I abandoned it many years ago. But that's first category I wanted to make mention of. You want to pick another category of stool testing to maybe make mention of? We'll go back and forth a bit.
Yeah, I think probably the most popular at this point would be PCR. In terms of like clinically, usually if you're going to do a stool test through LabCorp request from your doctor, it's usually PCR. If you do a sample at one of those places, that's what like the GI map is. The Genova test
GIFX.
is like half PCR, half culture. I think there's still a culture part on that test, right? But the way I view it is like they're taking partial DNA from the microbes. The way I've heard it described, which makes sense to me, it's almost like they take a picture. If they were trying to locate a microbe, they'd take a picture of like Nikki's eye, Nikki's mouth, Nikki's elbow, Nikki's foot, Nikki's knee, and be like, okay, this looks like Nikki. Like we're tagging different parts of the DNA, and this looks like that microbe based on the SNPs that we're getting. I think that it's decent, but there are some issues if you're looking at like really specific strains. There can be some inaccuracies if it looks like one particular strain versus another. Like if the pictures look similar, you can get some skewed results. But generally, I think PCR is decent in terms of like a stool testing method. But yeah, that would be another one.
What's interesting, if I may, about that though,
Yeah.
is that when you read microbiome research, what's interesting is really nobody is doing PCR-based stool testing in a research setting.
Right.
And
right.
similarly, they're not really doing culture-based stool testing in a research setting either. So it's interesting to me that PCR-based stool testing is all the rage right now. Again, like Genova GIFX, GI
Right.
map, LabCorp. LabCorp has culture too, but they have like a PCR-based, I think they call it like GI pathogen panel. So they have something like that. But it's interesting to me that, again, like the popularity in the marketplace has way outpaced
Right.
the presence in the research setting. And I find that interesting. It's kind of to a point where if I'm reading microbiome research and if I come across a study that uses PCR, I kind of do one of these and
right.
take pause and I think, oh, that's weird. And then I read the study. So that's the sort of oddball thing. And we're going to get into some of these individually in a moment. The other one I'll make...
That's interesting too. Do you think it's an expense thing? I don't know if that could be part of it or not. I know for some testing... go ahead.
Sorry. I vaguely remember asking Jason Harlech when we had him on. I don't remember if we were on air and if it's in that episode or if it was off air that we asked him that. But I made the assumption, I said, most of the research, and this actually segues beautifully. The next category of stool testing I wanted to make mention of is something called 16S. And it's taking fragments of rRNA and looking at that and identifying the microbe that way. But the vast majority of microbiome studies that you see are going to be 16S based. And I remember asking Jason Harlech, do you think that that's like, is it because it's been around for a while and it's just so well established, it's kind of the standard now? Do you think it's a cost thing because 16S is much cheaper? Or do you think it's like an accuracy thing? And he and I both speculated that it's mostly a cost thing because it is, like a GI map or a GIFX is like $400 versus a 16S test from BiomeSite or Ombre is like $100. So it's quite a bit cheaper. The thing that I have heard of 16S is that it's pretty decent at many of the levels. So at the phylum level, which is like the big, broad eagle eye overview level, it's great for that all the way down to the genus. Mm-hmm. So we could get all the way down to like Lactobacillus, Bifidobacterium, Klebsiella. But the moment you want to identify a species or heaven forbid a strain, that's where you start to lose the accuracy with 16S. So you're not going to get 100% accuracy telling the difference between Lactobacillus acidophilus versus Lactobacillus plantarum versus
Right.
Lactobacillus reuteri. But also, how much does that actually matter in a clinical setting? I don't know. I don't know if that really matters that tremendously, to tell you the truth.
Right.
But that is the one draw side. But 16S is what I continue to run occasionally on my patients. And I occasionally recommend it to students in FODMAP Freedom because it's cheap. And therefore, you could do repeat testing and monitor the situation more often. Or what I like to do now, because Stool is, it's not homogeneous, it's inconsistent from day to day. What I actually will do when I do this is I will have somebody order 3 kits and they'll do a stool collection on like Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then we take the average of those 3 scores when we're interpreting the results. So I like getting that. And that is still going to be cheaper than a GI map or a GIFX.
Right.
Because it's like $300 versus what, $380 or whatever it is for those. So that's kind of my testing preference at this point. Again, I'm not doing it on everybody, but I think that that's a nice, reasonably priced option that's going to give you reasonable data collection.
One thing I will say too about like the Ombre 16S type tests versus something like a GI map or the Genova like PCR testing. The Ombre test, you're going to need someone to help you interpret the data, probably. Like it's a lot of data that they give you. And usually it someone has to sort of assess the microbiome as a whole and be like, oh, things look okay. Here's a little bit of some squirreliness here. Or maybe you have low levels of good microbes. It takes a lot more interpretation for an Ombre test typically versus, you know, some of these GI map tests where you have like all these interpretation guides, you have all this, you have potentially more clinical support. So I find a lot of times providers that are using some of the GI map tools might not have really truly a great understanding of the microbiome. It's more like, oh, I looked at the interpretive guide and this is associated with SIBO, or like this is associated with more inflammation. And it's much more focused on looking for bad guys. A lot of like the GI map PCR test versus the Ombres is going to be much more of like, oh, here's an overview. You have to kind of interpret it. Whereas again, like I said, the GI map, there's a lot of like support. And I think that's what draws a lot of practitioners to it because they don't necessarily have to have a super great understanding of the tool in order to use it. Which again, I don't think is a good thing.
No, it's not.
I don't think it's a good thing. I think the way the GI map is set up is to be like, this is a boogeyman, go after it mentality versus really assessing the microbiome as a whole. Yeah,
a little bit more holistic, if you will.
Right.
And this is something too. I don't know if people realize this, but in our world, you probably have heard this at seminars and conferences, but sometimes in this world, you will hear the idea of plug and play or like a protocol, right? Like, oh, you don't need to learn anything. You don't need to have knowledge per se. You just need to implement this protocol,
right?
And then you're good. And that, you know, I appreciate it when companies have an interpretive guide or some sort of literature to back up their stuff. I actually think that's a good thing.
Right.
But there's a lot of lazy people, including in the medical field. And so what oftentimes happens, to your point, is that people like they get introduced to something like the GI map. They get access to the interpretive guide. And then they're like, cool, I'm an expert now. I'm going to start marketing this. And they have no clue what they're doing. And they prescribe the same protocols for everybody, no matter what. But Ombre, you're right, is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum where they have a portal. Like when you log in and you get your results, you can see a lot of stuff in the portal, which is decent. You're right, it's more holistic. It's not as heavily emphasizing like the bad boogeymen you need to kill. I really like that they at least take a stab at recommending nutrition, at least last I looked. So if your akkermansia is low, for example, they will have in the nutrition section a recommendation to eat more like berries to support akkermansia. Or if your lactobacillus is low, they might recommend that you eat yogurt or drink green tea as a prebiotic for the lactobacilli. So it's interesting that they have kind of the machine set up in a way
Right.
that they can make some microbiota nurturing nutrition recommendations, which I do like. Sometimes they recommend avoiding certain foods, and I usually tell my patients to ignore that part of
Right.
what Ombre is telling you because it's not always the most useful, and most of these people have wicked food fear anyway, so it's not worth going down that rabbit hole.
Right.
But I actually do let them play with like the foods to add, and I usually make my own recommendations for that matter, but I think that that's nice. And you know, like I have videos on my YouTube channel right now. I should probably do a rebooted version of it, but I have 1 or 2 videos on my YouTube channel all about how to interpret your Ombre report.
Right.
So the information is out there. I know for a fact because I've created some of it that's on the internet. But if you wanted to do something like an Ombre and use their platform and then use one of my free YouTube videos to try to interpret it, that is an option to you.
Right.
You know, I've seen enough of them by this point. I'm pretty comfortable saying that you could do that. But anyway, 16S, useful. You had briefly mentioned another type of testing that's available. Do you want to take the last one and mention this kind of new kid on the block, so to speak?
Yeah, this would be like a complete genome sequencing test. So really some of these scales that seem a little bit arbitrary, or I don't really understand how they're calculating some of these things where it'll say, oh, here's your ability to degrade oxalates. And you're like at 38%. And the reference range is between 40 and 60. Like there's sometimes these scales where they're using like equations and probably algorithms with the different microbes that I don't necessarily get with some of the full genome sequencing testing. And it's really common on some of those tests. It seems like across the board, they all have, you know, their GABA production and your folate level and like all these really interesting markers. But I don't really understand all the ins and outs of how they're calculating that. And it could lead people to conclusions that might not be beneficial to them if they don't know how to interpret the tests.
Well, not to mention, too, this is a really good example of if you believe the test more than your own experience and your own symptoms, that can easily lead you astray. So, as an example, I did a series of 3 tests with Biome FX. And so I did 2 samples from the same day, same poop, just like stirred it up, partitioned it into 2 containers and mailed it off. And then I did another sample the following day. And I wanted to see if the samples were relatively consistent from one to the other, particularly on that split test day. But I also wanted to see if you get a lot of variability one day to the next. And I will say, to their credit, this particular test was very consistent from one to the other. There were very minor fluctuations between the days. And I have a whole YouTube video about this if you want to check that out. But the one real beef that I have with it, which ironically is their biggest selling point, is exactly what you're talking about. So there's like for the BioFX, for example, it's the second half of the report, and they'll give you your ability to degrade, or your microbiome's potential to produce histamine and hydrogen sulfide and methane. It'll give you like butyrate production, acetate production. It'll give you, I think you're right. I think oxalate might be on there, but there's a lot of these very sexy, very like cool markers. But when I looked at mine, it made no goddamn sense. Like just knowing my health and my history and my symptoms and my experience of my body, I feel pretty darn good. Like I know I feel pretty good on a day-to-day. If anything, mild constipation here or there, but that's getting better all the time. I know for sure, because I've checked it on Chronometer many times, I definitely eat enough fiber. I eat a good variety. Like I get some probiotics in my diet. I do a lot of these things. But as an example, I know that symptomatically and dietarily, I am a person who should be making plenty of butyrate. but my BioMFX test showed that I was at the 0th percentile for butyrate production.
Right.
Which made no freaking sense.
Right.
Paired with the fact that on their own test, they showed that I had normal levels of several of the butyrate producing species, including Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. Like, I didn't understand that. I was like, this test is claiming that I have plenty of a butyrate producing microbe, but no potential to make butyrate.
Right.
And like, it didn't make any sense. And I actually talked with some people in the lab, and basically the thing that we all concluded from that meeting was, yeah, we're probably like a little bit ahead of our time, even trying to put this on a commercially available test. And it's neat, but like, it's probably not going to be 100% accurate. And again, you're better off taking the whole picture into consideration, the person's diet, the person's symptomology, their history, the microbes that you see on the exam versus what you're seeing down below. So honestly, this is one of the biggest selling points for that particular test. I have seen spokespeople from that company sell it at seminars, and I've heard their shticks. And the biggest selling point for the test is the exact reason why I don't run it super commonly myself, because I think it's way too tempting to see that information and run with it. And I think that it's way too easy to let that information lead you astray. Even if I, the clinician, tell you, the patient, oh, don't worry about this, we're going to ignore this, it's so tempting. It's going to suck people in.
It's gonna, people that we work with already have doubt and fears and PTSD from this whole experience. You don't want to create more of that. It is interesting. Again, it's the actual part of the test where it looks at the microbes and you can do your own sort of interpretation if you understand the microbes, could be valuable and sounds like pretty accurate and reliable data. It's the trying to extract clinical pearls that seems a little bit wonky. It sounds like.
Well, and again, it goes back to this idea of frankly lazy clinicians where, they don't want to commit to memory which microbes produce butyrate. Right. It's much easier for them if they can have this fancy little scale down at the bottom of the test that tells them how much butyrate your patient's going to be producing. So it's just, I know that they put that there, because it's a marketing strategy to get people to see their test as special and unique, but also it's a marketing technique to market their test to clinicians because it makes it very easy to interpret and utilize the test. But again, if the information is wrong, I don't think that's worth putting on the test. Like, I would rather they include an interpretive guide that says, here are the bacteria that are known to produce butyrate. You figure it out on your own.
Right. Right.
Or like they could break it up. They could have a category of like bacteria that produce butyrate, and then they could tally it up or something. There are other options, but yeah, I think that they're probably jumping the gun with the functionality testing. And it's not just BioMFX. Last I knew, Somagen did the same thing.
Yes.
And did I ever tell you this, by the way? So Genova Diagnostics has their GIFX test, which is, I think it's PCR. There's like one page that's culture still, like a throwback from the CDSA. And they might even have some 16S on that test as well. But they have that test. And now they have a new version of the test where you basically get the GIFX plus a whole genome sequencing test. And it's just the Somagen test.
Oh, really?
That's all it is. Yeah. They just contracted with Somagen and they paired the two together. But the price is so much higher if you order both of them through Genova versus if you ordered the Somagen test all by itself. I was flabbergasted at the price difference.
Wow.
So, little pro tip before you spend money on that, not to knock Genova. But okay. I think let's wrap up with the tea, unless you had something else to throw in at this stage.
I am ready to drink some tea.
You know all the tea. You know better than anybody else. Yes. You and my husband. So as I mentioned, I did some split testing with BioMFX, and that one performed reasonably well. We should probably do a whole episode about urinary organic acids testing. That's a whole nother topic for another day. But I will say I did the same thing. I sent in 2 oat tests, my own pee that I collected and stirred and everything. I sent 2 oat tests under 2 different names to the lab, and the oat was fairly consistent. I think Lucy Mailing did a really nice job picking that apart as far as like the claims that the oat tests can diagnose candida, which I think is pretty well proven to be false at this point. But I will say, if nothing else, the samples are consistent within one another. So that is something to go off of. I'm not backing this test. I'm just saying at least it's consistent. The one that really started it all, though, was the GI map. And I won't tell the whole story, but long story short, I had become very suspicious of the GI map and whether or not it was accurate. And I had 6 patients back to back in all different areas of the country who supposedly came back with moderate detectable levels of Giardia. And it was like I remember it like it was yesterday. The first persons came back and I was like, damn, they have Giardia. That's crazy. Let's treat it. And I told them, what herbs to take. The second persons came back and I was like, whoa, what are the odds? 2 people back to back have Giardia. That's crazy. Let's treat it. The third persons came back and I was like, okay. So I told that person, hey, I do find this a little suspicious, FYI, but better safe than sorry. Let's just have you do, the raw garlic or whatever treatment you want to do. Let's at least treat it just to be better safe than sorry. Then the 4th, 5th, and 6th sample all came in, all with Giardia, again, from all different parts of the country. And I was like, I think I smell bullshit. And I remember one of them, she had 2 toddlers at home and she had a newborn. And I was like, girl, are you going on like camping trips and drinking out of creeks and doing like outdoor stuff with your newborn and your toddlers? You're crazy. And she was like, I have not left my house in 2 months. So we're like, okay, so if there's not Giardia coming out of your damn tap water or on the produce you're getting at Kroger, I don't know where you're getting this. I think it's probably not true. So I had suspicions about that test for a long time prior to that anyway. So I had 2 people, one FODMAP Freedom student and one of my private patients, both do split sample testing. So I had them do from one stool sample, one day, one poop. They took the sample, stirred it up to the best of their ability, and then they partitioned it into 2 GI map collection kits, which we sent in under 2 different names. And I had them submit a sample to LabCorp and Quest. And I was really flabbergasted and dismayed to see that the results were wildly different. Like the one dude, one of his tests told him he had like a funky E. coli infection from the first page. I forget which one. One test told him E. coli infection. The other one, no E. coli, none, not detected. The girl, one of her tests told her she had Giardia. The other test, no, not detected whatsoever. You're squeaky clean. And there were a lot of other discrepancies with it, like calprotectin was all over the place and did not agree with LabCorp or Quest. Fecal elastase was all over the place and did not agree with LabCorp or Quest. There was a lot of indiscrepancies with numbers on the test, and I made a YouTube video about that split testing, and I basically said in the video, I said, I don't think this is worth the paper it's printed on. I'm going to not recommend this test anymore, and I don't recommend that you get it. And long story short, the company got very nasty with me and threatened to sue me, and I had to remove the video from YouTube.
Yeah.
So it is what it is, but now, 2 years later, I can tell you I probably should have been a little bit less prickly.
Snarky.
Because I was pissed.
Right.
People spend good money on these tests. And importantly, people spend money on these tests, which they are told are the best.
Right.
And the God's gift to mankind is the GI map. They worship this stupid thing like the Bible. They do everything that they're supposed to do based on the test results. And then guess what? A lot of the time, they still feel like dog shit.
Right.
And so these are the people who come to believe that they're just a difficult case. They are just a lost cause. They've gone to the fancy doctors. They got the world's best stool test. Sorry, I couldn't say that with a straight face. But, like they come to believe that they have hit the end of the road because they had the best stool test and there was still no relief for them and there were still no answers for them. And I guess that they're just a tough case. And that's simply not true. If you get a lousy, inaccurate test and you don't get better based on that, frankly, unusable information, is that on you or is that on the test? I think that's on the test. I don't think that means that you're a lost cause or you're never going to heal or your microbiome is jacked. I think that means that it was the test's fault all along and it's not a you thing. And you should absolutely keep trying things and pursuing your goal of health and looking elsewhere. But it's the hopelessness that really gets me with this.
For sure. And I agree. I've definitely seen some squirreliness with calprotectin and elastase. Not with split sampling, but if someone comes back with like a really low, typically I see it generally trending a little bit lower on the GI map is what I've seen compared to other tests. So like compared to Quest or LabCorp, a more traditional test. Calprotectin, again, I've seen kind of skewed different directions with different patients. So usually, again, the clinical data, I would want to confirm with another test if they were running typically a bit low, but I would be very skeptical of that stuff based on what I've seen. But yeah, it was a journey. I was there with the journey for the journey, and I think another thing I'd like to bring up too is that you did another video that then did you release it? I can't remember if you released it.
I released it, but when they threatened to sue me, and it scared me and really like freaked me out. I didn't delete the video you're going to refer to. It's just unlisted. Right. So if you go to my channel, you can't see it, but I still have the link to it and I can send it. Like, I think I might have even sent it to you at some point. Right. And I'm sure I sent it to Jason Harvilak when we spoke with him. But
yeah, that one,
it's there. I just hide it.
And that one to me is super fascinating because what you did in that one was you looked at 100 tests and looked at patterns. And if I remember right, was there only one person with low bifido?
Yep.
And like not very many people were low in lactobacilli either. I think it was
Correct.
like maybe 7. Yeah, I remember it was like 10 or below, something like that. Which again is not really consistent with research on IBS and gut issues. So that was really fascinating to me. And then I remember too, sometimes things were listed, like the genus was undetected, but then there was a species that was detected, which made no sense.
Yeah, so it would be like, it would be, and this happened a shocking amount. Like I think on Staphylococcus, the genus versus Staph aureus, the species, I think this discrepancy happened like 70% of the time. It was staggeringly common. But what she's describing now is that the bigger umbrella of the genus would be undetected, but then the species would be there. And so it would be like, oh, we don't see any Staphylococcus, but here's all the Staphylococcus aureus we found.
Right. Like we don't see any mammals, but here's humans.
Yes, exactly. Like That's exactly. It's like you're measuring one or both of those incorrectly. Like you get that, right? Both of these statements cannot be true. You can't have 0 mammals but have 100 humans.
Right.
Like, you're confused. You're drunk. Go home. But the same thing was happening with like Candida versus Candida albicans, Klebsiella versus Klebsiella pneumoniae, Pseudomonas versus Pseudomonas aeruginosa. There are several cases on that particular test where they break down the genus versus the species. And that was actually one of the first reasons why I became suspicious of that test. Because after a couple of years of using it, I started realizing, okay, this doesn't make sense.
Right.
What they're claiming here. And also I started just casually observing the bifido thing because you're right. When you read microbiome research, the recurring theme across the board is, wow, pretty much all of us in the developed countries are deficient in bifidobacteria. Number 2, if you've had antibiotics like ever, you're probably going to be deficient in bifido. 3, if you were not breastfed, you probably are deficient in bifido. And like, how common is that? And also, freaking gluten-free diets and low FODMAP diets are consistently shown to reduce bifido.
Mm.
And here's all of these patients that are coming to me who are pretty much universally on a gluten-free diet or a low FODMAP diet, right? Like minimum 80 to 90% of my patients come into me on one of those 2 diets. And then we look at their GI map samples and only one person was told that they have low bifido. It just doesn't make a lick of sense.
Right.
But that one, I can at least give them the benefit of the doubt. I think maybe they're measuring the bifido correctly, but they set their range incorrectly. Maybe that's the beef with the bifido. Right?
That makes total sense.
And that was probably part of what bit me in the ass doing this YouTube video and this whole kerfuffle, because I titled it, "The GI Map is Inaccurate."
Right.
And like, the truth of the matter is I can't make that many claims on like the accuracy of their equipment or the accuracy of their methods. What I can speak to is the clinical usefulness of doing this test, right? Because like, I can see the clinical side of things. I'm not in there in the lab observing them, and seeing what their methods are. So I think that was part of what really bit me in the butt, is that I was a little bit, again, I was pissed. I was persnickety. I was prickly. And I titled it in a way to grab attention, and it absolutely did. But I think if I were to do it again, I would probably be a bit more cordial and less worked up about it. It's hard when you see what these people go through and how much money they spend seeking health and seeking answers. And it's frustrating to think that there are products out there in the marketplace that are unhelpful, and they're just rolling in the dough, raking it in because their marketing happens to be really good.
Yeah.
So it stinks. But I think executive summary from this episode is our current consensus between the two of us right now is that neither of us recommend culture-based testing. Neither of us recommend any of the PCR-based testing at the moment. I will occasionally run a whole genome sequencing test for shits and giggles, but I don't run them very often because I think that it's way too tempting to get sucked into the fancy schmancy stuff at the bottom of the panel. And that does not appear to be usable at this stage of the game. So if you could order a test like that and then just choose to ignore all of the fancy stuff in the back half of the report, more power to you. But I don't find that a lot of people are capable of really ignoring that. So, it's like, if it's printed on paper, we think it's true.
Right.
And honestly, this is part of the problem with the health world in general. There are so many instances, unfortunately, where you have a lab test that comes back and it is actually actionable and relevant and important, and your shitty ass doctor tells you to ignore it.
Right.
Last I knew, my sister-in-law's ferritin was 5, like the number of fingers I have on my hand, or digits I have on my hand. 5. Boy. And her doctor told her, nope, not a big deal. Don't worry about it at all. Gosh. 5. So there are so many instances where healthcare providers tell you to ignore a data point that absolutely is important, that I understand why a lot of people have trust issues and a lot of people want to pay attention to something that's printed on black and white paper. And that's, again, why I don't choose to order the whole genome sequencing test right now, because I think that most people are not capable of seeing something like that and ignoring it, or taking it with a very large grain of salt. So right now where I'm at, and I think you're at too, is that we'll occasionally run a 16S test like Ombre or BiomeSite if you're not in the United States, and that'll give you something to go off of. But even there, just remember that the vast majority of the microbes in the gut, we don't even have a name for yet. We have no idea what they do. And so a stool test is still going to give you a very limited view of what that ecosystem looks like. So Trust your body, trust your experience, trust your gut above all else. But if you want to throw in this one data point, sure, go for it. Do you think that was a good summary?
Yeah, good summary.
All right. Let's wrap with this. let's remind the people where they can find us on the internet. So I'm on YouTube and Instagram as the Gut Microbiome Queen. Gut.microbiome.queen on Instagram. Just Dr. Daneza Gut Microbiome Queen on YouTube. And what is your handle, my darling?
My handle is Amy_Hollenkamp_RD.
On Instagrams.
Yeah, on the grams.
So come find us. We lurk in the internet in varying capacities at varying times. Certain somebody's going to be going on maternity leave before we know it, so she might be ghosting us on the gram for just a little while, but we'll cut her some slack. I think that is a viable reason why she might ditch us on Instagram for a little while there. Maternity leave is a good excuse.
I think so. But I might pop up. Who knows? Maybe I'll show my sleep-deprived face here or there. Just for fun.
There. So keep an eye on her stories when she's on maternity leave. That's what we're translating it to here. All right, gang. Well, we will see you right back here for another episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast, where we uncover the bullshit that's holding you back and maybe talk about shit at the same time. Until then, toodaloo.